It's good to be with you again today, and I hope that everyone has had a good Christmas season and that 2022 will begin to move us a little closer to some semblance of historical normalcy. But regardless of what's going on out there, it's a blessing to be able to meet together in here, as the gathering of the Lord's people is so very critical to our spiritual well-being. I have to tell you that I had a little bit of a crisis this afternoon. I pulled up the Judson Road YouTube page to see what this morning's lessons were on, just to make sure that there wouldn't be any overlap. And to my surprise, Cade gave a fantastic lesson on Obadiah. And believe it or not, I planned to reference Obadiah in this lesson. I mean, that's got to be a once-in-a-lifetime coincidence for two fill-ins to reference some of the same material, particularly when it comes from that obscure of a book in the Bible. So I spent the better part of an hour or so trying to decide if I wanted to just forge ahead or pull something out of the file cabinet. But after listening to that entire class, I decided that most of my fears had not been realized, and that rather than 80% of the lesson overlapping, which is what the first 5 minutes led me to believe, only about 20% or so overlapped. And the ultimate conclusions from that class this morning and our time this evening go in very different directions. So the good news is that by 7 o'clock this evening, everyone here is going to be experts on the subject matter on the book of Obadiah. But it was an excellent lesson, Cade. Good to see the college classes are paying off. As I mentioned, we find ourselves in the Christmas season right now. For some, most notably probably the youngest among us, this time of year is the highlight of the annual calendar, what with the anticipation of Santa Claus bounding down the chimney. For others, this time of year can be draining or even lonely. But whether the month of December is joyful or stressful, the one thing that the Christmas season tends not to be, at least for those among the churches of Christ, is religious. Certainly, most of us celebrate Christmas from a cultural perspective. We decorate trees, exchange gifts, listen to carols, and watch our favorite holiday films. But the one thing we don't do is celebrate December 25th as the birthday of Jesus. And that's not without good reason. December 25th is almost certainly not the day on which Jesus was born, and the reasons for drawing that conclusion are many and are probably well known to most in the room this evening. We are quick to state that we celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus every first day of the week, but have little desire to celebrate the birth of Jesus, particularly on a day lacking in historical validity. But sometimes we have the tendency to become near militant Scrooges in our efforts to shun all things related to, quote, the reason for the season, to the point that we might be missing opportunities to share the good news about Jesus with those who might inquire of us why we don't celebrate Christmas for the same reason as most. Christmas tends to be one of two times a year most likely to bring visitors into our midst, either family or members of the community who might otherwise never pass through the threshold, the other, of course, being Easter. And I wonder sometimes how our worship on or near, such as today, December 25th, comes across to them when they hear nothing, typically, of what they expect to hear of the birth of Jesus, but yet also hear little to nothing of why we are not celebrating that event. We tend to be so risk-averse when it comes to even uttering the word Christmas in a religious sense on or around December 25th that I can envision those who might visit our assemblies leaving thinking, what's the matter with these people? Do they even believe in Jesus? And if you think I'm off base with this assessment, ask yourself how likely it would be for someone to lead number 440 in the songbook today. And if you don't have the song numbers memorized, it's Silent Night. It's easy to imagine that such a visitor might leave feeling very confused with regard to just what do these people think and believe about Jesus. And perhaps a return visit would never materialize. A wonderful opportunity to share the life-saving message of Jesus, and all too often it doesn't happen because sometimes we're more concerned with being right than with being evangelistically opportunistic. To me, the Christmas season is a marvelous opportunity to do what Priscilla and Aquila did for Apollos in Acts chapter 18 when, quote, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And so for just a few minutes this evening, I want to talk about the birth of Jesus. But I don't want to talk about the specific day on which it happened. Instead, I want to talk about something that is far more profound. I want to talk about how the birth of Jesus occurring when it did was the climax of a struggle between two members of the same family that spanned more than 1,900 years. And my hope is that the next time we are awkwardly asked why we don't celebrate Christmas as the birth of Christ, we'll be able to use the moment as an opportunity to speak about the birth of Jesus more accurately. Matthew chapter 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted, because they are no more. History knows the events of verse 16 of Matthew chapter 2 as the massacre of the innocents. Herod the Great had all the baby boys in Bethlehem and the surrounding villages under the age of 2 killed in an effort to preserve the role of King of the Jews for himself. Aside from having clear connotations with the early years of Moses' life, Herod's efforts are exceedingly cruel and vindictive. Though, considering his ancestry, such efforts to eradicate Jesus should come as no surprise to the perceptive student of the Bible. But to understand what's really happening in Matthew chapter 2, we have to first turn our attention to the book of Genesis and the person of Abraham. In the closing verses of Genesis chapter 11, we are introduced to Abram of Ur and of how the Lord calls him to leave his home, his family, and his gods, and to travel along the Fertile Crescent to the land of Canaan. Eventually, Abram reaches the village of Shechem, and it is there where, for the first time in the land of Canaan, God states the great promise. And one of the elements of the great promise is that Abram will have many descendants, and as Abram continues to age, he fails to see that portion of the promise realized. In chapter 15 of Genesis, Abram's frustration reaches its peak as Abram boldly criticizes God, questioning God's integrity and faithfulness as the result of his still being childless. In response, God offers that famous retort of, "Look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. So shall your offspring be." And in due time, that promise sees its fulfillment in Abraham's son, Isaac, being born to his wife, Sarah. But we know that this is not Abraham's first son, that distinction goes rather to the child that Abraham conceived with Hagar, Ishmael. And this provides a pattern whose role will be revised in successive generations, where the younger son will receive blessings that would normally befall the elder son. And the struggle between the descendants of these two sons will bear itself out in later portions of the biblical story, such as when a later younger son, Joseph, will be sold into captivity to a group of traveling Midianites, who are often referred to instead as Ishmaelites. The descendants of Isaac will be affected by the descendants of Ishmael. The tension between Isaac and Ishmael did not end when Hagar and Ishmael were sent out into the wilderness. But Isaac will go on to marry a woman by the name of Rebekah. And after struggling, like his parents, to become pregnant, Isaac offers a prayer to God asking for a child. And Genesis chapter 25 records for us that, quote, "The Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger.'" The text goes on to record for us the names of the twin sons she gave birth to. The older, Esau, and the younger, Jacob. And it's the Lord's prerogative to decide to run the great promise through whichever descendant of Abraham he chooses. And in doing so, through sons who are often younger and weaker and seemingly less significant, God slowly conditions his people to have no surprise when the ultimate descendant of Abraham and the Redeemer of all mankind, Jesus, is born in the most humble, lowly, and scandalous of ways. But these two brothers, Esau and Jacob, would prove to be the best of friends, right? Not at all. From the moment of their births, they struggled with one another, with Jacob even seemingly trying to hold his brother back from being born first, as Jacob left Rebekah's womb holding on to the heel of Esau's foot. And the book of Genesis records for us a plurality of events within the lives of Jacob and Esau that demonstrate a tension between these two brothers. Though importantly, a tension that will not die with them, but that will linger for generations through their respective descendants. And we know some of these stories well, of how Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for a measly bowl of stew, of how Jacob steals his brother's blessing with the help of Rebekah by deceiving his dying father's failing eyes and pretending to be Esau. For this latter infraction, you'll recall that Esau purposes in his heart to kill Jacob, the end result of which is that Jacob will flee to Paddan Aram to the north of Canaan. And while on the way to Paddan Aram, Jacob will stop in Bethel, where he will have his famous dream of the staircase reaching up to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. From the highest reaches of the staircase, the Lord declares to Jacob, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Later, while returning to Canaan, Jacob will wrestle with the angel of the Lord in the Jabbok, who will change his name to Israel, which is a fitting name as it means wrestles or struggles with God. Taken together, the events at Bethel and in the Jabbok present Jacob as the forefather and ancestor of the Israelites. And it's by Israel's descendants that the eventual offspring, through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed, Jesus of Nazareth, would be born. Though Jacob will not be the only son of Isaac through whom a great people would come. And this is where our Venn diagram will begin to overlap with Cade's lesson this morning. Back in Genesis chapter 25, we learn that Esau too comes to be known by another name, Edom, which shares a root with the Hebrew word for red, so named because of the color of the stew for which he sold his birthright. In Jacob's new name, Israel, the reader is reminded of a moment of great valor and courage when Jacob wrestled with God all night and was not overcome. In Esau's new name, Edom, the reader finds a perennial reminder of a moment of great folly and foolishness. Whether in action or in name, Jacob is shown to be wiser and more determined than his older brother, and thereby being more worthy of being the son through whom the great promise would flow. Truly, the older shall serve the younger. But as his new name shows, Esau will become the forefather and ancestor of another nation. From Edom will come the Edomites, a nation that will migrate to the eastern shores of the Dead Sea and for generations prove to be an enduring enemy of the Israelites. The deep-seated animosity between the descendants of these two brothers, between the Israelites and the Edomites, will become so robust that in his famous oracles given in the book of Numbers, the prophet Balaam will even go so far as to say, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab, and break down all the sons of Shet. Edom shall be dispossessed, Seir also, his enemies shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities. To reinforce this reality, that the Edomites are descended from Esau, we read in the opening verses of Deuteronomy chapter 2, of Moses' recounting of the wilderness wanderings when he writes, quote, "Then we turned and journeyed into the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea, as the Lord told me. And for many days we traveled around Mount Seir. Then the Lord said to me, you have been traveling around this mountain country long enough. Turn northward and command the people. You are about to pass through the territory of your brothers, the people of Esau, who live in Seir, and they will be afraid of you." Seir and Edom are used interchangeably in the Bible, as the prior passage in Numbers demonstrates. Earlier in the narrative, Moses and the Israelites asked permission to cross through the land of Edom on their journey out of Egypt, but they were refused passage by the Edomite king. And from that point on in the Bible, Edom is mentioned as Israel's enemy, and the two nations fought frequently. Both Saul and David fought against the Edomites, with David conquering them and forcing them into labor. During the reign of Jehoram, Edom rebelled against Judah and set up their own independent king. The Edomites continued to be a problem for the Israelites and even raided Judah after it fell to the Babylonians. Because of Edom's sin in raiding Judah and taking delight in Israel's fall during the Babylonian captivity, the Lord pronounced judgment on Edom. God declared that Edom would be a wasteland occupied only by wild animals. The book of Obadiah, as was discussed at length this morning, deals specifically with Edom's judgment. The Edomites were proud, violent, and apathetic to the destruction of Israel, and God promised a reckoning. After the Edomites were driven from their land by the Nabateans, they migrated to the southern part of Israel and became known as Idumeans. And perhaps you now know exactly why we've spent the last few minutes recounting the story of God from Abraham through Jacob and Esau, Jacob and Esau. We're simply building the background that brings theological significance to the birth of Jesus. When we think about Herod, what was it that made him so great? It certainly wasn't because of who he was as a person. Herod was a man who, aside from babies, killed his own wives and sons out of fear that they were trying to usurp his power. He was an evil man, governed by megalomania and self-infatuation. His reign as king of Judea was marked by ever-present efforts at appealing to Roman rulers and Roman ideals. What earned him the moniker, quote, the Great, in history was his building efforts. Caesarea Maritima, Masada, Jerusalem, and in particular the massive expansion of the Temple Mount as an attempt at endearing himself to his Jewish subjects. But of all of Herod's great building projects, arguably the one closest to his heart was the one he named for himself, the Herodium. Here, Herod literally moved a mountain in order to build a fortress and later resting place after his death that towered over everything that fell in its shadow. And falling within that shadow, just a few miles to the northwest, was a small backwater village that we know as Bethlehem. And so it is not only history that brings Jesus and Herod together, but also geography, as their lives will overlap on multiple levels, as if they are two boxers in separate corners, but both standing in the same ring, competing for the title of king. But of all that we know about Herod the Great, it is a seemingly obscure biographical statement from a well-placed source that helps us to best understand why this particular ruler was who God chose to confront and challenge Jesus for the title of king. In the 1st century A.D., Flavius Josephus served as a Jewish priest and later became the commander of Jewish forces in Galilee, following the revolt against Rome that began in A.D. 66. Captured by the Romans, Josephus spent his later life in Rome under the patronage of the emperors, where he composed a handful of historical accounts. Among them, a recounting of the Jewish wars and his magnum opus, the Antiquities of the Jews. And it's in the latter where Josephus records for us that, quote, they gave the kingdom to Herod, who was no more than a private man and an Idumean. Who then is Herod the Great? He's an Idumean, which means that he is an Edomite. And if he is an Edomite, then he is a descendant of Esau. Do you see the games that God is playing with history? Like any good book, the end is given away in the beginning, but only if you know how to read the book. Some 1900 years later, and when Jesus is born somewhere around the year 6 or 5 BC, under the reign of Herod the Great, the tension between Jacob and Esau and their descendants, between the Israelites and the Edomites, is reaching its climax. God keeps his promises, often working in and through history in the most unlikely and surprising of people. Two men, both claiming to be the king of the Jews and competing for loyal subjects. The question, therefore, becomes, which one is the true king and the rightful heir to the throne? Is it the one born first or the one born second? Is it the one who claimed it for himself through shrewd and cunning political maneuverings, or is it the one who was despised and rejected by men? It was a question that would have to be answered by Judean Jews of the first century BC, and it is a question that will have to be answered by all men everywhere today. The question under consideration this evening is one with an obvious answer, though one that tends to be harder to live out in reality. Who is your king? The superficial powers of this world, or the genuine power now seated at the right hand of God? And on the surface, we all know the answer. The rightful king of the Jews is the one whose cross bore that very designation. And most in this room have made that declaration, having died and been buried with him in the waters of baptism. But, as all good East Texans know, the proof is in the pudding. The one we claim as our king is the one to whom we show our allegiance, our loyalty, our fidelity, our faithfulness. It is the one we serve. It is the one we look like. But this evening, the question for considerate reflection is, are we truly serving him at all times, or only when we are, quote, in his presence? At the time of Jesus' birth, all of Judea's glory, power, and magnificence belonged to Herod the Great. But in the small backwater town of Bethlehem, a baby was born. And we are asked to believe that that baby is the descendant of Jacob, who is actually Lord and King over everything. When we look at our world, the power of evil often appears to be so big and so strong that it often makes us question that we can ever do anything about it, or how can we ever stand up against it. But this is what God asks us to believe, that no matter what our culture looks like, no matter how evil or immoral or ungodly our culture appears to be, Jesus Christ is King. And it's not Herod. It wasn't then, and it isn't now. But do we dare to live as if God is stronger than the evil we face in our own lives and in our own culture? Do we dare to live as if the power we have within us is greater than any power that is against us? And all too often it seems like we aren't living that way. We often live as if Herod, or the modern equivalents of Herod, meaning the evil powers of today, are really in control. It's the baby in the manger who is the Lord of heaven and earth. And so the story of the struggle and the tension between Jacob and Esau reaches its climax when the gospel story, as told by Matthew, begins with these incredible words. In the days of Herod the king, Jesus was born. Jesus and Herod, Jacob and Esau, the descendant of one known the world over, the descendants of the other wiped from history, never to be heard from again. God is faithful. Christ is king. And not just one day a year, but all 365 of them. Jesus isn't just the reason for this season. He's the reason for every season. Now, let us worship the King.